All right, so throughout the Trump administration, we had to suffer through many Russian hysteria stories about Trump, where the liberal media and some Democrats were trying to push the narrative that Donald Trump was literally like a Manchurian candidate who was secretly his strings were being pulled by Putin behind the scenes, and he was really working for the Russians, etc., etc. This was the narrative that was being sold by liberal pundits. Specifically, I'm going to show you a clip from Rachel Maddow talking about this story, but as part of the Russian hysteria epic, there was one specific story about Russia potentially paying Taliban members with bounties on American troops' heads, and that the Taliban then went and killed American troops and took those bounties. So that was the story that came out, and many people on the left were quick to ask basic follow-up questions, which it seems like many of these mainstream media outlets didn't do. Basic follow-up questions like, hey, where's your concrete evidence for this? And the response was never anything substantive. So it was a story that they never really had any concrete evidence to show us to verify that Russians were putting bounties on American troops' heads. And this was all happening as Donald Trump was discussing trying to semi-withdraw from Afghanistan. And given Trump's withdrawal idea from Afghanistan was not a legitimate withdrawal, he was half-assing it just like previous presidents, but this story was really something that Democrats leaned into and tried to leverage against Trump in the run-up to the election to try to paint him as this Manchurian candidate and also play into the intelligence community's hands who don't want us to pull out of Afghanistan. So here are the new details that we have just been made aware of. But again, a lot of this shit we already kind of knew. U.S. intel walks back claim Russians put bounties on American troops, so they're walking it back now. It was a blockbuster story about Russia's return to the imperial great game in Afghanistan. The Kremlin had spread money around the longtime Central Asian battlefield for militants to kill remaining U.S. forces. It sparked a massive outcry from Democrats and their hashtag resistance amplifiers about the treasonous Russian puppet in the White House whose admiration for Vladimir Putin had endangered American troops. But on Thursday, the Biden administration announced that U.S. intelligence only had low to moderate confidence in the story after all. Translated from the jargon of spy world, that means the intelligence agencies have found the story is, at best, unproven and possibly untrue. The United States intelligence community assesses with low to moderate confidence that Russian intelligence officers sought to encourage Taliban attacks U.S. and coalition personnel in Afghanistan in 2019 and perhaps earlier, a senior administration official said. So that is the narrative that they were putting out there, right? And it turns out that there was no real evidence for this. They had low to moderate assurity that this was a real and legitimate story. And I cannot downplay how big of a story this was in the mainstream press. Like, this was something that was wall-to-wall coverage for weeks in the mainstream media. And so they continue on here. This is just to give you an idea of where the information came from, because this has been a long-going problem, an ongoing problem with how the United States intelligence communities get some of this information. According to the officials on Thursday's call, the reporting about alleged bounties came from detainee reporting, raising the specter that someone told their U.S.-aligned Afghan jailers what they thought was necessary to get out of a cage. Specifically, the official cited information and evidence of connections to criminal agents in Afghanistan and elements of the Russian government as sources for the intelligence community assessment. So, basically, this is analogous to how our torture programs in the past have failed. And I'm not saying they were torturing the person who came up with this story, but this is why these types of sources cannot be trusted as 100% verified information. Because yes, when you're torturing somebody in many cases, as we have in the past, or whether you're detaining somebody, they might lie to you in order to get their way. They might lie to you in order to stop being fucking tortured, or they might lie to you in order to try to get some sort of benefits or get out of prison. So that's why these information sources can't usually be trusted. But of course, that's where it came from in this instance, and they just jumped on it as if it was 100% confirmed. They continue on here as well. There seemed to be no causative link to any actual U.S. deaths in the judgment of General Frank McKinsey, the senior U.S. general for the Middle East and South Asia, and former diplomats and intelligence officers told the Daily Beast last summer that they viewed the bounties account skeptically. One retired diplomat, and this is important, suspected someone leaked this to slow down the troop withdrawal. And I think that's probably, at least to an extent, relevant in this case. Yeah, I mean, when Trump is discussing withdrawing troops from Afghanistan, and there are forces that don't want him to withdraw from Afghanistan, it wouldn't be all surprising that somebody leaked this information because they knew the media would jump onto it, and they wanted to slow down the ability for anybody to be able to withdraw our presence in Afghanistan. So that would make sense to me. And this is the ironic part at the end here. Rarely discussed was the main reason to believe the story, which is that the CIA actually did fund Afghan guerrillas to kill Russian forces during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in the 1980s. Who are we funding in the situation that they're talking about here? The Mujahideen, who then went on to, in at least some part, become Al-Qaeda. So yes, the irony of this entire situation is summed up there in the end. But yeah, I mean, this was something that they were all jumping on. We had Rachel Maddow doing these absurd, ridiculous segments. I'll show you one here just because it really is laughable how they were covering this story and how dramatic she was in her coverage of this. So let's go ahead and watch this.
This is sort of stunning. Here's the lead. American intelligence officials have concluded that a Russian military intelligence unit secretly offered bounties to Taliban-linked militants for killing coalition forces in Afghanistan, including targeting American troops, amid the peace talks to end the long-running war there, according to officials briefed on the matter. The U.S. concluded months ago that the Russian unit had covertly offered rewards for successful attacks last year. Islamist militants or armed criminal elements closely associated with them are believed to have collected some bounty money. The official said 20 Americans were killed in combat in Afghanistan in 2019, last year, but it was not clear which killings were under suspicion.
So it's not clear. It's not clear which killings were under suspicion, by the way, none of them. But I'm going to go ahead and just put this out there that it might have been 20. Maybe it was 20. But I'm just going to throw that out there, even though, again, there's no confirmation of any of this. So continue.
The intelligence finding was briefed to President Trump, and the White House's National Security Council discussed the problem at an interagency meeting in late March, according to these officials. Officials developed a menu of potential options, starting with making a diplomatic complaint to Moscow and a demand that it stop, along with an escalating series of sanctions and other possible responses. But despite having created that menu of potential options for the president, quote, the White House has yet to authorize any step. The officials did not explain the White House delay in deciding how to respond to the intelligence about Russia. Yeah, raise your hand if you think you might be able to explain that delay from the White House.
Go ahead, do it. I mean, explain it. What is your explanation, Rachel? I mean, she literally would probably go on this deranged rant if she were to actually answer that question. So I don't actually want her to answer that in this circumstance. But I mean, seriously, what do you mean? Raise your hand if you think you know why Trump isn't doing what? Sanctioning the shit out of Russia for a story that you don't even have confirmation of? Is that a real question? Raise your hand if you can explain it. Okay, go ahead and explain it. What are you going to say? That Putin is pulling the strings behind the scenes and is trying to do a cover up here where Donald Trump is covering up the fact that Putin is killing American troops. Come on.
I mean, this is jaw-dropping. This is like kind of sickening news, right? Even for those of us whose jaws are already sprained from having dropped so far and so frequently this summer. I mean, if this Times report is correct,
it's not.
Means that U.S. intelligence has concluded that Vladimir Putin is offering bounties for the scalps of American soldiers in Afghanistan. Not only offering money to people who kill Americans, but some of the bounties that Putin has offered have been collected, meaning the Russians at least believe that their offering cash to kill Americans has actually worked to get some Americans killed. The Russians at least believe, if these bounties have been paid out, that the people to whom they have offered this money have successfully gone out and killed American soldiers because of it, and the Russians have therefore paid for that service. And President Trump was told about this in March, and he has done nothing about it. He was given what?
Okay, so, I mean, again, what exactly would you like him to do about this? What do you want him to do about this if it's an unconfirmed report? What do you want him to do about it? You want him to sanction Russia for something that you don't have confirmation of? What are you talking about? I mean, they have nothing to talk about, but it just shows you her priority in this was continuing the narrative, right? Her entire priority in doing this story was continuing the narrative that she has been selling, the entire time that Donald Trump was president, which is that Putin is behind the scenes pulling the strings and Donald Trump is a secret Manchurian candidate for Russia. That was the narrative she was selling. And so this was just another example of her continuing to sell that narrative. This report, this anonymous intelligence report, just happened to fall in line with the narrative that she was selling, because all she cares about is ratings. She doesn't care about the validity of the story or the confirmation of the truth behind the story. She was just doing this to continue the narrative. I mean, could it be any more clear than this, with the dramacy behind what she's talking about? And then, I mean, when they cite that they think that Trump should have been doing sanctions against Russia, well, the Biden administration cited the Russian bounties claim as a reason for new sanctions as recently as yesterday. So here's what they said. The sanctions will be among what President Biden's aides say are seen and unseen steps in response to the hacking known as SolarWinds, which they do say that they have high confidence of that Russia was responsible for, to the CIA's assessment that Russia offered to pay bounties to militants in Afghanistan to kill American troops. So as recently as yesterday, Joe Biden is continuing to push this story as, again, and this is what I'm talking about. This is not even necessarily new information, right? It's being brought up again right now because we have more people coming on the record and that are talking about how there's no real confirmation here. But this isn't necessarily new information, right? U.S. Commander, Intel still hasn't established Russia paid Taliban bounties to kill the U.S. troops. And this is from September 2020. This is from September. And as recently as yesterday, Biden is using this as a justification for more sanctions. I mean, it just tells you how deeply unserious a lot of these people are, right? That this was the main story in the mainstream media for a minute. For a while, this was the main plot, especially for commentators like Rachel Maddow. So it just shows you how ridiculous this is. Never, ever, ever, ever trust anonymous intelligence officials at their face value, because there's always going to be potential ulterior motives, or there's always going to be gaps in how they obtain the knowledge because you can't verify it. So that's why you don't trust these types of anonymous intelligence reports. And of course, you know, they use this again to boost their ratings and continue the narrative that they were selling. But this is really remarkable. I mean, the fact that this is just a brazen story that was one of the biggest stories in the entire liberal media for weeks. And it turns out that there is low to moderate confidence that it's even true at all.